Hey there, guys. Nordic Warrior, how's it going? Yeah, spear of the moment, blah blah. You know the deal. Let's not ramble. Let's get right into it. I wanted to make a little video today, kind of expanding on something I talked about very briefly in a community post. So, sometime last week, you guys all saw I made a community post where I was just kind of laughing and joking around about a headline that I saw that was being shared around Twitter about Nottingham University. Now, I used to live in Nottingham, so that was kind of why it caught my attention so quickly. And I actually know people who work at that university, but I digress. Nottingham University had a particular professor, a black guy, or a lecturer, whatever you call it. He was somebody in a high position in that particular university, and he decided to change the curriculum for that university to basically teach the students that Tolkien and Lord of the Rings was essentially works of racism, right? That it was promoting white nationalism or Christian conservatism, Christian nationalism, whatever you want to call it. Essentially, he I don't know if he'd read the books or he'd seen the movies or whatever, but his opinion was that Tolkien's works were essentially white nationalism, right? That's what they were basically trying to low key promote. That they came out in an era where that stuff was more prominent and more generally accepted by society. And there also wasn't as much information like the internet and whatnot. So essentially, it went over people's head at the time. And it was about basically a warning, or an irrational warning, as I'm sure he would put it, against mass immigration and diversity and things like that. And I found it really, really funny. If you guys go and see my community post, you'll know why I found it so funny and ironic. But I'll talk a little bit about that later. But the reason I wanted to go ahead and make a video about it is because it kind of reinvigorated in me an idea that I had years and years ago for a video that I was going to make. And it was a video about basically the overall situation that you get when people try to politicize Tolkien's works. Because the thing about Tolkien that's always fascinated me, again, this is something I wanted to talk about on here a long time ago. I just didn't really know how to start. I didn't really know, I didn't really have an excuse to really get into it. But what's always fascinated me about Tolkien is how wide the overall appeal was with his work. You would have people with all different sorts of backgrounds, different nationalities, different political agendas, different religious beliefs and stuff like that, who would be big fans of Tolkien. Like you would have like hardcore atheists, liberals, and people like that reading Tolkien's books and trying to politicize them. At the same time, you would have sort of reactionary conservatives, people on the alt-right, Christian truthers, things of that nature, people like me who are just born-again Christians, who would also look at Tolkien's work and try to politicize them on our side. And everybody seemed to always have their own interpretation on what Tolkien was trying to say. And I always found it really, really weird how there was that big mass appeal there. So essentially, just to go into some of the theories you'll hear about Tolkien's work, more specifically from kind of the reactionary right or the alt-right, or even just like general conservatives who have an interest in his work. What's generally believed, or was for a very long time anyway, like I haven't heard anybody speak about this in years, but what people used to say back in the day is that Tolkien was essentially what you'd call a paleoconservative. What I mean by a paleoconservative, and he wasn't really clear about this himself, but if you examine a lot of his interviews and a lot of his writings, a lot of his work, his affiliation with C.S. Lewis and whatnot, as well as some of the overall themes in his books, paleoconservatism is basically anarchism, right? It's basically you're a conservative, but you reject the idea of government, of any sort of feudal system, of temporal power. So basically, you could be a Christian, you could have strong beliefs in God and things like that. And Tolkien himself was a devout Catholic. It's worth pointing that out. But you don't essentially feel connected with the church, or you don't think that the church should have any sort of political or, like I said, temporal power. And you instead have a longing and a desire to go back to the way things were prior to technology taking over and prior to big cities being built and things of that nature, prior to the Industrial Revolution. Now, I used to live in Nottingham, and again, Nottingham was kind of where the Industrial Revolution kicked off. So a lot of the history we got taught in school was about that revolution. We actually went to the Framework Knitters Museum, which I used to live right around the corner from that, come to think of it. But yeah, that was a big portion of where the Industrial Revolution in that part of England kicked off, when England was more rural. And the idea with Tolkien is that he had a longing, along with other paleoconservatives of the time, they had a longing for when England was this rural place with small little villages, small little pubs that were kind of the heart of the community, where there wasn't really much of a government. There was just kind of a local sheriff system. Like if you look at the Shire, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but they don't really have a government. They don't really have any sort of temporal rule. They don't have any sort of feudal system, nothing. There's no real electoral system. They just have a few of the bigger, stronger hobbits are essentially their sheriffs who attempt to guard their borders and things of that nature. They don't really have any crime. They don't really have any problems. And that's kind of the romanticization of paleoconservatism kind of thing. So a lot of people look at that and they look at the villains in Tolkien's universe. So Sauron, Saruman, the Orcs, the Easterlings, the Haradrim, they're all external tormentors, right? External forces. They're all somewhat demonic in their depiction. And if you look at the magical item that kind of brings it all together is the One Ring. Now, the idea that a lot of paleoconservatives had back in the day, when the books were first written and all that, and this was kind of adopted generations later by the reactionary right, is that the ring represents that temporal power. That the ring essentially represents the idea of a one-world government, of a feudal system, of oppression, of the ruling class, basically because... Just to explain a little bit about the lore, and I don't really want to get too much into detail because I could sit here for hours talking about Tolkien's lore, but essentially what the ring is, Sauron, who is essentially a depiction of Satan, right? Or more specifically than Satan, he's more of a depiction of the Antichrist, right? Because if you look at how it works in Tolkien's system, you have the Maiar, who are essentially angels, right? They're the messengers of God. You have Iluvatar, who is his depiction of God, who sits on the throne above all. And then you have the Maiar, which are his angels, right? His followers. And you had a particular Maiar called Melkor, who was kicked out of Arda and later became Morgoth, right? That's essentially more of a depiction of Satan. And Sauron came generations later. He was another Maiar who fell under the influence of Morgoth. And he essentially became what he was. He became the main villain of the series and whatnot. So he's basically the Antichrist. And the One Ring was basically the ruling ring over a whole bunch of others, right? So Sauron, along with Celebrimbor and the elfsmiths of the time, created a ring of power, or a group of rings of power for all the ruling class of Middle-earth. So they gave them to the men, basically the kings of the kingdoms of men, the ruling class of the elves, who are the wisest, oldest, and fairest. They're basically an angelic race of immortal white people who, depending on who you ask, kind of... They kind of represent ideal whiteness, basically. That's how some people have depicted it. I've got my own opinion on that. I'll talk about that later. And also the dwarves, who are basically troglodytes, right? They essentially represent Scottish coal miners who were considered the working class of the time, and were also considered kind of greedy and kept to themselves and things of that nature, and very, very stubborn and difficult to deal with. So Sauron gave them all rings of power as a free gift, right? He gave them a ring of power to kind of enhance their position. But he also fashioned in secret one ring that was connected to all of them. And that ring, as a lot of people have talked about who study the lore, represents, like I said, temporal power. And through that ring, he attempted to coerce and control all the kings of men, the kings of the dwarves, the wisest and eldest of the elves, and to essentially control the entirety of Middle-earth creating one hive mind with him in control, essentially, through the One Ring. So that's why a lot of people have taken the ring to mean temporal power, right? One ring to rule them all. That's what a lot of people think it represents. And again, there's a few issues with that theory, but we'll get into it. And if you look at, like I said, the Shire, I mentioned before Tolkien being kind of a paleoconservative, and paleoconservatism was very common from the time. The Shire is basically a very, very idealistic look at what rural England was supposed to be, right? It was a very high trust society. Again, there was there was no crime whatsoever. There was no immigration whatsoever. There was no need to lock your doors at night, as some people say. It was a very high trust society. Everybody congregated around the local pub, and it's just a very idealistic society in a nutshell. But the problem with that theory for me, and the problem with seeing that as what Tolkien was trying to get across, is the fact that if you study the lore a little bit deeper, it's a situation where you see that while interpreting the Shire as a romanticisation of paleoconservatism and old rural England, it's also not particularly pragmatic or practical, and Tolkien was very clear about this, because if you know the history of that region, basically the history of the north of Middle-earth, the Shire and the entirety of northern Middle-earth is essentially a giant ruin, right? It's the remnants of the old kingdom of Arnor, and the old kingdom of Arnor fell many, many generations ago to the forces of Sauron, even after Sauron himself was killed, or was believed to be dead and whatnot. He, of course, came back due to the ring, but I digress. And the kingdom of Arnor was a benevolent kingdom, right? It was ruled very, very well by Elendi, who was descended from ancient Numenor. Again, a race of conservative white men from an island far across the ocean, right? I believe in some people even believe in Tolkien's work it's a flat Earth, but again, that's a whole different rabbit hole, I guess you could go down. But basically, the kingdom of Arnor was a benevolent kingdom, but after Elendi died and after Sauron was defeated, it fell into ruin. They fell into squabbling amongst themselves. The temporal power of that kingdom slowly lost its rule, and the kingdom fell into ruin. It got took over by various other factions like the Orcs and the men of Carn-dûn and the remnants of the Witch King's army and things of that nature. And the Shire was essentially fashioned in one particular portion of that, and it's important to understand that the hobbits are human, essentially. They're men. They're just another race of men. They're just a particularly smaller and weaker race of men who aren't descended from ancient Numenor. They're descended from a completely different line. But basically, the only reason, and this is very important to bear in mind when you think about Tolkien's political agenda, or at least trying to politicize Tolkien's works, thinking that you know it all and you have all the answers. The only reason that the Shire is allowed to exist is because of the remnants of ancient Numenor and the remnants of Arnor. Okay, the remnants of the kingdom of Arnor that still exist are the Dúnedain, right? The Dúnedain Rangers, who are based in a place called Sarn Ford, which is right on the borders of the Shire. And the Dúnedain are essentially waiting for the king's return. It's basically a part of their religion and their culture, is that they themselves have a longing to re-establish the kingdom of Arnor, and each of the lines of that kingdom are essentially caught up with the Dúnedain. They're raised by the Dúnedain, they're protected by them, they're kept in secrecy. And although they are basically shunned by everyone around them, like the people of Bree, the people of the Shire, the people of Buckland and whatnot, they view the Rangers with suspicion. They view the remnants of the old kingdom of Arnor with suspicion, and they don't really want to have anything to do with them, and they don't like them being around, but they tolerate them because they can't really do anything about it themselves. The only reason that the Shire and places like that are able to exist is because of the remnants of that kingdom, because the Dúnedain Rangers patrol the borders of the Shire constantly. They keep it safe from wolves, from orcs, from evil men, things of that nature. They're always there, they're always guarding. And once they're taken away, in the events of the Return of the King, you'll find that the Shire becomes an easy target. And the people of the Shire, despite being good people, despite being a high trust, morally morally ideal society, again, a romanticisation of rural England and paleoconservatism, they are completely unprepared for invasion. They're completely unprepared for any sort of conflict, and they get taken over pretty easily. Again, they have an overall arrogant attitude towards the outside of their own borders. And again, this is kind of a problem with paleoconservatism. It's kind of a utopian way of thinking. And again, you look at the way the hobbits behave, they know nothing beyond their own borders. They're not particularly intelligent or wise compared to some of the other races. They're just idealistic, they just kind of do what they do. They don't really bother anybody. And whenever one of them kind of breaks from that programming, like we see with Bilbo, the rest of the hobbits see them with suspicion and kind of are unsupportive, if that makes sense. So again, when you try to politicize Tolkien's work, when you try to say that he's really, really pushing for paleoconservatism, and that I've even seen some people try to say that he wants to destroy the very concept of government. Like, he sees, again, the ring, whereas it represents temporal power, some people have even gone as far as to say that it represents any form of government. Whereas if you look at Saruman, for example, he's somebody who you could depict as like a pope type figure, right? Very, very wise, very powerful, ancient individual who kind of gets corrupted by his own power and his own jealousy and his own greed and whatnot, and becomes kind of a pathetic figure. Because that's another thing that Tolkien talked about, is he talked about how evil is ultimately quite pathetic and petty. And again, it's a situation where I feel like people take that and they extrapolate it, and they don't really know what they're talking about, if you ask me, in a lot of cases. So yeah, without going on a massive tangent and spending the rest of this video just talking about Tolkien lore, various aspects of it, and trying to interpret it and things of that nature, believe me, I could do that for hours. I'm not going to bother with that here. I just wanted to basically talk about the main point of the video and what set it all in motion. So the college professor, or whoever the guy was, from the University of Notts, who basically made that standard that the article is based on, coming up with the idea that Tolkien or Tolkien was a racist, that Tolkien was a white nationalist, that his works are basically a manifesto for far-right conservative politics, and that everybody should throw those books in the fire. And if his college students, who are trying to get a degree for their careers and whatnot, don't adhere to that doctrine, they basically shall not pass. That was kind of the joke that was made in the headline of the article and whatnot. What was it that set that in motion? Well, as you guys will know if you read the community post, I found it really, really funny and really, really ironic, because the thing that set that in motion, and bear in mind what I mentioned earlier about how evil, the way that Tolkien often depicted it, is often very pathetic and often very hypocritical and not particularly sympathetic. Like, if you look at a lot of villains in fiction, and I've talked about this in the past, if you look at popular villains like Anakin Skywalker, for example, from Star Wars, and there are various other aspects of this, you can often find some sort of political ideology or some sort of tragic backstory or some sort of reason to be sympathetic towards a villain, right? Maybe they have certain things about them, certain personality traits that make sense. Maybe their heart was in the right place once, but they just got corrupted. Or maybe their ideology, in theory, does make sense, but they get a little bit too deep with it and become a utopian, which causes them to do evil things. Again, Darth Vader is a perfect example of that. He's a character who was essentially a political idealist, a morally good man who was motivated by love, but who went on to become an imperialist fascist. And not really out of a sense of evil, more out of a sense of trying to bring law and order to the galaxy so he can put a stop to suffering and slavery and degeneracy and all the other kinds of crap that he grew up around as a slave living on a barren desert planet ran by gangsters. His idea was that he could bring law and order to the galaxy through the Empire, but of course he turned to the dark side and lost himself along the way. Well, Tolkien's depiction of evil isn't like that. No, Tolkien's depiction of evil is literally pettiness, jealousy, just a desire for power in general. And it's pretty obvious when you look at a character like Saruman. He's a character who is just deeply jealous of characters like Gandalf and Radagast, because even though they're not as powerful or as wise as he is, they are more loved by the people than he is. So, he'll scold a character like Gandalf for smoking weed, while he himself has like barrels of pipe weed in his pantry, and he tries to take over the Shire purely out of a sense of spite, just because they don't love him as much as they love Gandalf. That's essentially what his desire for power comes down to. It comes down to pettiness and just him always having to be the best. His own ego, his own narcissism turned him to evil, even though he really had nothing to gain, nothing tangible anyway from doing what he did. And again, Sauron is basically just a depiction of Satan. So yeah, Tolkien's depiction of evil is always very hypocritical, always very petty, and always kind of reveals itself in the end. All foul things come forward, as you hear. Well, the guy that set this in motion, the college lecturer, whatever he was, his reason for seeing Tolkien as a racist and for seeing Tolkien's works as essentially racist propaganda was the fact that he saw Lord of the Rings or read the books or whatever. I'm assuming he probably just saw the films. And he saw some of the villains from Lord of the Rings, so more specifically the Orcs, right? Now, what are Orcs? Orcs are basically demonic corruptions of the elven folk, right? Who are, again, like I said before, they're angelic folk. They're immortal, angelic, wisest people in Middle-earth, right? The oldest and wisest race in Middle-earth. They're, as near perfect as you can possibly get. Kind of, I joked earlier saying they're like the ideal white people, if you know what I mean. That was a joke, by the way. The Orcs are essentially the complete opposite. They're a corruption of that. They are a bastardization and a corruption of the elven folk, right? So they're really, really ugly, really, really degenerate, really unhygienic, really violent. Basically, they can't build, they can't produce anything of their own. Everywhere they go, they just BLM, right? They burn, loot, murder. They end up, if they don't have a strong chieftain to keep them under control and keep them in check, they literally just eat each other. Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys. That kind of thing. They come out of, like, literally they spawn from, like, the pits of hell in a barren wasteland called Mordor. They're all kind of gender androgynous. They have no moral decency whatsoever. They're not particularly articulate. Again, everywhere they go, they just burn, loot, murder. Okay, they're just violent, savage, demonic monsters. Okay, they are a corruption of pure good. They are literally a depiction of pure evil. They are demons from the abyss. So this individual, this leftist, saw that. He saw those people, right? Those characters, Orcs, and he thought to himself, "Those are black people." That was his. But this doesn't come from me. I'm not saying this, right? This doesn't come from Tolkien. Tolkien never said this, right? This doesn't come from the Cimmeril community or anything like that. This doesn't come from the Tolkien legendarium. No, this literally comes from leftists, right? They saw this guy. They saw the Orcs, right? Let me just sum this up. I know I'm rambling here, but I'm speaking specifically to this guy here, right? This black guy, this leftist in Notts University who's pushing this standard, right? You saw Lord of the Rings, right? And you saw the Orcs, and when you saw the Orcs, you thought to yourself, those are black people. Those are ethnic minorities, right? You saw the Orcs, right? Again, a corruption of pure good, right? Violent, evil, savage, irredeemable monsters who will kill and eat everything in sight, right? And including each other. Again, they are literally just pure evil incarnate who spawn from the pits of hell to do nothing but burn, loot, and murder. You saw those characters, and you thought that they were a depiction of black people, right? You thought that they were a depiction of immigrants coming to this country. And somehow that makes us racist. Somehow that makes Tolkien racist. Somehow that makes the Tolkien fan base racist. Because you, I'll repeat this again, you saw orcs and you equated them with black people. That somehow makes us racist. You know? I mean, I don't need to explain why that's funny or why that's ironic or why that's hypocritical, but it goes to show what I've been saying for years. I've been saying this for a long time about how leftists, everything they do, like all they ever do is project. All right, they call us hateful, right? They say we're hateful people, right? Talking about the right, we just hate everybody, right? We're just complete evil, irredeemable monsters who just hate everybody. But they're the ones who literally show nothing but hate. If you judge people by their fruits, you'll see we are the most productive people in society, right? We're always trying to help people. We're actually a lot more inclusive than they are. We don't ban people for their opinions. We don't, we're not out in the street dressing up in masks and attacking people for their political opinions. We're not shooting people in the street, literally gunning them down on college campuses for their political opinions. No, that's what the left are doing, right? So the left are the most violent, hateful, like degenerate people out there. But they always like to project that onto us. But you also get that in regards to accusations of racism, and it shows you who the real racists are, and it shows you who, kinds of people who have such an identity crisis. Because again, the guy who, I know most of the people who criticise Tolkien over the years have been white liberals. There's actually a lot of black people who are fans of Tolkien. I've met quite a few of them in my time, and if you hang around in that community, you'll find that, like I said, the Tolkien fan base is worldwide. It's such a phenomenon, and it has been ever since the 1950s, right, when the books came out. It's got such a wide mass appeal among numerous different races, as I talked about near the start of the video. But I digress. Where was I going with this? My point is, again, it's mostly white liberals who have criticised Tolkien over the years. But this one guy, this university dude, a black guy, saw the orcs. This is why I call it an identity crisis. This guy saw orcs and he identified with that. He saw them as him. He saw himself in the orcs. So he would see a character like Gorbag and think, wow, that's me. That could be my uncle. What does it tell you about certain communities and how they view themselves and how they've been brainwashed to think? Like, man, it's crazy to think about. It really is. So I just found this pretty funny. And look, it comes in the aftermath. Like, part of the reason I wanted to even make this video too is because on my last live stream, now if you guys saw my last live stream, you'll see that it was, I spent about 5 hours in that live stream talking about recent events and responding to things. And one of the things that I summed up, like, I think towards the end of that live stream, is how, or midway through it or whatever, there was certain individuals recently who were calling me racist. Right, that's part of the reason that certain people were calling me a fake Christian, because they're saying that I'm motivated by racism and hatred, right? There was one particular black guy who said that to me within the past few days. He said that I'm a fake Christian and everything I do is out of hatred, right? And it's all motivated by racism. The ironic thing is, I have literally, and you could go through my entire internet history, right? Anything I've ever done on this channel and before, I have literally never said anything racist in my entire life. Like you could never find you. I guarantee you will never find me ever making a racist comment or a racist statement. You know why? Because it's objectively false, right? The idea that I'm racist, that I just hate people because of their race, it's objectively untrue. And again, you judge people by their fruits, not by their reputation. And I might have a reputation of being a racist just because people say I'm a racist. Kind of like what we see with Charlie Kirk. Everybody keeps calling him racist. The guy's literally never said or done anything that could even be interpreted as racist. So anybody who says he is just flat out lying. But this ain't about Charlie Kirk. And again, we're seeing that retroactively with Tolkien, right? Tolkien never said anything racist in his entire life. He just happened to create works of fiction where some of the characters in it, some of the villains, were just evil demonic monsters that are ironically being associated by the left as people of a certain race. I mean, how ironic is that? Though I need to put it into words. And it's not just the Orcs. You have the Haradrim and the Easterlings and the men of Khorne Dûm, even the Black Númenóreans, who, again, those they're not actually black people. They're called black because they fell into service. They turned to the dark side, right? They fell into the service of Sauron. They were brainwashed. They were deceived. That's why they're known as the Black Númenóreans. They're the opposite to the White Númenóreans, who continued, who descended to the lands of Gondor and Arnor, right? That's where they're descended from. Again, I'm talking too much about lore here. I digress. But people will see that. They'll see the word black, and they'll see that the Orcs maybe are dark-skinned or whatever, and they'll also, even though they're a fictional race of monsters, they're not real, okay? They don't exist in real life. People will see that and associate it with immigrants and black people, and then call us racist when they're the ones who made that connection, not us, Even if we might say it jokingly. And that's the thing, I've never said anything racist. Like, if I make a joke at the expense of a particular race, that's called humour. It's called humour. I make jokes about my own race all the time, about my own nationality, and about I'll joke about literally anybody of any faction. It doesn't matter to me. Likewise, if I say something that's factual, like because I know what some people are going to say, they'll scour my videos and my live streams, and you'll say, well, you said that black people in America commit most of the crime. Yes. You know why? Because they do. Because that's a factual statement. Now, if you're telling me that factual statements are racist, then you have a problem with the truth. All right. Now, do black people commit most of the crime in America? Absolutely. Are they the only people who commit crimes in America? No. Is committing crime wrong? Yes. Would I criticize a white person for committing the same crime? Yes. You know why? Because I believe in equality. I treat people equally. I don't discriminate. Now, is taking a statistical fact about a group of people, a particular faction who commits more crime than another group of people, and bearing that in mind when you make judgments, is that a form of irrational discrimination? Because if it is, then that's like saying, oh, if you're scared to be around a tiger, or you don't trust a tiger around your children more so than you would a puppy, like a Jack Russell, like, is that a form of irrational discrimination when, on average, a tiger, an animal like a tiger would be more dangerous than a puppy, right? But if you're worried about letting that thing in your house or letting it around your children, is that irrational discrimination? Is that racism against a tiger? Well, no, that doesn't make sense, does it? If you look at a type of person who, again, because a certain level of discrimination is not the same as racism, right? If you run a shop, for example, right, and you let certain groups of people into the shop, let's say you let a bunch of school children into your shop, you let like 20 of them in at once during a lunch break, are you more or less likely to get shoplifted than you are if you let 20 old grannies from a care home into your shop? No, you're going to have a certain level of rational discrimination. You're going to say, no, hang on a second, them school kids, you can only come in two at a time. That's what they do in a lot of local shops in the UK. They'll say, hey, hang on, only two at a time. The rest of you wait outside so we can keep an eye on you. Because school children have a habit, especially nowadays, they have a habit of shoplifting, right? Because, again, it's just for whatever reason, that's what school children do, right? So certain levels of rational discrimination make sense. So me coming out there and in a live stream and pointing out the cultural issue in the black community in America, that they commit the vast majority of crimes, right? They're overrepresented in terms of arrests and things of that nature in the prison population. It's like if you look at Islam, for example, right? Is it a form of irrational discrimination to think that you're going to have more of a chance of a terrorist attack when there's a large population of Muslims in a particular city than if there's a smaller population of Muslims in that particular city? Well, I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that the vast majority of terrorist attacks in this country, and again, I've studied terrorism in depth because I had to for my job, right? The terror threat right now in this country is substantial, right? If you work at a comedy festival or a music festival or something like that, you have to be specifically drilled on anti-terrorism protocols. Now, can you think of any group of people, any particular faction that would raise the terror threat level that are being imported into this country at an alarming rate that would raise that threat level? Because I can. Now, is that a form of irrational discrimination? Is that a form of racism? No, it's simply reality. It's being a realist. And back to the subject of Tolkien. You know, I talked earlier about how Tolkien might have seen the Shire as a romantic, idealistic, white, conservative English community, or again, Paleoconservatism, right? That's the ideal, but it wasn't practical. And by reading all Tolkien's books and studying his lore, he could see that it wasn't practical, because what a society like that lacked was, it lacked security, like it lacked border security in particular, and it lacked a certain sense of law and order. So under the old kingdom of Arnor, you had the king who ruled through a feudal system, and essentially he was able to rule with an iron hand, right? He had a very powerful army of men who would keep any external threats, external tormentors, or demonic influences out of society. If there were any cults of Sauron that popped up, he would deal with it, and he would deal with it with extreme prejudice, okay? So when Aragorn, who is essentially the last in the line of Elendi, is prophesied to retake the throne of Gondor, and by extension he would also be the king of Arnor. He would essentially rule two kingdoms at once, but I'm assuming he would delegate temporal power to somebody else to retake the throne of Fornost, rebuild that land, exterminate all the cultural enrichment that took place in that land, and reform the kingdom of Arnor. Essentially reform some form of temporal power. I don't really see how you can look at that and come to the conclusion that Tolkien was this anarchist who had a serious problem with kings and had a serious problem with authority and security and things of that nature. I feel like that's a situation where a lot of people on the right misinterpret what Tolkien was saying. And you have to bear in mind too that Lord of the Rings is a fantasy world. It doesn't always depict real life, okay? There's a lot of things in that world that just are really fanciful, right? Now you can obviously make allegories and comparisons to real life, but it isn't literally real life. So it's unwise, in my opinion, to take it too seriously. Like, again, it could just be that the ring is just a magical item that turns you invisible and keeps the Dark Lord alive, right? Like a Horcrux, in Harry Potter, that kind of thing. It doesn't always have to be taken literally, but it's fun to speculate and it's fun to make allegories. But I just find it funny how like those books have been out for so long, and yet people on the left are kind of in an attempt to kind of use them to poke criticism at people like us, people on the right, conservatives. They just completely expose themselves. And you know, if you look at the way that like Black Lives Matter, you know, BLM, the way that they acted after the fentanyl overdose of St. George Floyd, you know, that crackhead. If you look at the way they behaved in the aftermath of that, if you look at the way that Antifa behave, again, dressing up in masks and throwing battery acid at people and, you know, threatening people, crowding around them, kicking their heads in 10 on 1, and then crying and calling the police whenever anybody punches them. You know, it's funny because they say they want to defund the police and, you know, they want to get, all cops are fascists and ACAB and all that. You know, they put up all that propaganda everywhere and say they hate the police. They're out there openly calling for people to shoot cops and shoot federal agents. Yeah, do you know, if you run one of these people over or you bitch slap them or something, what's the first thing they do? They call the police. They call the police and say, "Oh, that right-wing fascist just punched me. Those people are violent." You know, that's how they. Again, it's the pettiness that Tolkien warned about in his works. You know. So I don't know where I'm going with this video. This was just I'm literally about to go to work as I'm recording this. So I was pissing myself laughing earlier thinking about this, and I was playing a video game earlier, one of the Lord of the Rings games, and I was like kicking the crap out of orcs, and it was making me think about this stuff and making me do some meta analysis in my own head and all that. And it's funny because like I had no idea where I was gonna go with this. I really didn't. Yeah, it's just some food for thought. But again, it's like people, even now, in 2025, you think that this would have died down. You know, you think that buzzwords would be stale, but people keep calling me racist, and they keep trying to use that. Because you can't really say anything about me, anything tangible, to kind of pick apart my morality and paint me out to be a bad person. All you can really do is perpetuate lies. That's all you can really do. And by saying that I'm a racist simply because I make jokes or I speak the truth, I post and discuss statistical facts, that makes me a racist somehow. I mean, doesn't make any sense to me. Maybe someone else can can explain it to me. I even talked on my live stream. There was a couple of people that were bringing up even the subject of white nationalism, and that's the thing. Like, again, you can call me a racist all you want, and say that I was inspired to be racist by Tolkien or some stupid nonsense like that. But at the end of the day, I don't even believe in white nationalism. I made this very clear on my last live stream. Right, somebody asked me explicitly, what are my views on white nationalism? Like they asked me to basically clarify, because I don't know if I've made it if I've made it a little bit unclear what my views on white nationalism are. Like do I actually think it's a because again, I'm a very political person these days. Is it a political ideology that makes sense to me? Is it something that's practical or pragmatic? I don't think so. Like the way that I described it on my live stream is the sense that, or is to say that I'm sympathetic to the cause of white nationalism. I understand why. I think every person, every race of people, every culture has a right to their own privacy in that sense. You know, you have a right to choose whether or not you want to associate with your own people exclusively or other races. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And that doesn't just apply to white people. That goes for Asians, blacks, like whoever else. You know, many people out there, the vast majority of people, because it's just natural, are going to prefer to be around their own people. And every single culture deserves to exist. I do believe that. And we all have our place in this world. You know, God made borders and languages for a reason, ever since the days of ancient Babylon, okay? I don't believe in the concept of a one-world government or a utopia. But at the same time, I feel like white nationalism as a political ideology is utopian thinking, as well as dangerous thinking, because it's not practical in any way, shape, or form, and it's not pragmatic, okay? We live in a democracy, or in theory we do anyway, and you're never going to be able to force people to only adhere to one political ideology. You're always going to have difference of opinions, and you're always going to have people who could care less about race and race politics. In order for white nationalism to become a reality, you would have to become a utopian. Okay, there would have to be a lot of bloodshed, a lot of violence, a lot of civil wars, a lot of world wars, and there would have to be genuine kingdoms set up, feudal systems that prevent any immigration and prevent any integration whatsoever. And I just don't think that's practical or possible. So while I'm sympathetic to the cause, it's not something I'm going to support or get behind, because look, there's some things are more important. Okay, I'm a Christian. I think that believers of all races and all cultures have to unify against our real enemies, which is the left, right? The satanic elite. Those are our real enemies. And I don't think it's wise at all to be letting petty things like, and maybe I shouldn't say petty things, I shouldn't really trivialize race, because it is important. I just don't think it's as important as certain other things, as spirituality and whatnot. So I feel like letting race overcome all of that is kind of petty and is kind of short-sighted. So while I'm sympathetic to the cause, it's not something I can ever really get behind. I want to make that perfectly clear. I know I did say that on my live stream. I figured I would just reiterate it here for anybody who didn't see and sum up a bit much. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. I don't really know where else to go with this. If truth be told, just a bit of background noise, I guess. It's kind of incoherent. Let me know what you guys think anyway. You could have some, you could have some interesting discussions on this topic. Let me know what you guys think of Tolkien. I am going to review the books in full. I just got done finishing Fellowship of the Ring recently, and I'm going to reread Two Towers and Return of the King. Kind of refresh my memory on a lot of the lore and things like that, and I'm going to discuss it because Tolkien's work is fascinating. It is. So yeah, let me know what you guys think anyway. Thanks for watching. God bless.